He found her at dawn, a ghost against the fence line, not standing, but kneeling in the dust, her back to the rising sun. The wind pulled at her thin dress, a pale flag of surrender. For 10 years, Silas had seen nothing but cattle and crows on this land, nothing but the endless dialogue of dust and sky. Now there was a girl, and she was praying, or weeping, or dying. He gripped the worn stock of his rifle, the wood smooth as river stone against his calloused palm. His heart was a cold knot in his chest. Another ghost had come to his gate, and he had no room for more. The land had already taken its share. He watched, unmoving, as the sun broke free of the horizon, spilling liquid gold across the plains and catching in the fine hairs at her neck. She did not stir. The rifle felt heavy, an anchor of old habits, protection, distance. The rules he had lived by for a decade, but the girl was a question the rifle could not answer. Her stillness was louder than a scream. He lowered the weapon, the click of the safety, a sharp, metallic sound in the vast silence. He began to walk, his boots crunching on the dry earth, each step a reluctant concession. One step for curiosity, one for a flicker of something he'd long since buried. Pity, perhaps, or memory. He stopped a few feet away, casting a long shadow that fell over her small, huddled form. She was young, younger than he'd thought. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and tangled with bits of grass, a stark contrast to the impossible delicacy of her profile. He could see the tremor in her shoulders, the rhythmic rise and fall of a body fighting for its next breath. He cleared his throat, the sound rusty from disuse. "This is private land." The words were stones thrown into a deep well, and he waited for an echo that did not come. She did not look up. Her hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles white. He saw then that she wasn't praying. Her hands were clenched around something small, something hidden from view. He took another step. The scent of rain-starved earth filled his lungs, a smell of perpetual waiting. The girl finally tilted her head, not to look at him, but toward the sprawling, empty ranch house that sat like a weathered monument on the low rise behind him. A single, dry sob escaped her. It was not a sound of weakness, but of profound, bottomless exhaustion, the sound of a journey's end. Silas felt the cold knot in his chest tighten. This was a complication, a disruption to the carefully constructed peace he had mistaken for living. He had built his world out of fences and silence, and she had knelt right through them. He took her into the house, not with a gentle hand or a kind word, but with a gruff, non-negotiable gesture. He pointed toward the porch. She rose on unsteady legs, a fawn testing its footing, and followed without a word. The house smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. Dust motes danced in the sparse columns of morning light that pierced the gloom. It was a place where time had been carefully arrested. A rifle leaned in one corner. A set of worn harnesses hung from a peg. A single tin cup sat by the stone sink. Everything had its place. Everything was for one. She sank into the simple wooden chair he offered, her body surrendering to it as if it were a feather bed. Her eyes, dark and wide, scanned the room, but they seemed to see through the walls, into the past, or some distant place he could not fathom. He placed a glass of water on the table before her. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, and he saw the dirt ingrained in her skin, the raw scrapes on her palms. He turned away, busying himself at the hearth, adding a log to the embers. The fire was his one constant companion, a flicker of life in the stillness. He tended to it like a sacrament. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a physical weight on his back. The silence in the room was different now. Before, it had been his. Empty, yes, but his own. Now it was shared, filled with her unspoken story, with the questions he refused to ask. He fetched a clean cloth and a bowl of warm water, setting them on the table beside her. He did not look at her as he did it. It was a gesture of pragmatism. A sick guest was a liability. He had work to do. Fences to mend, cattle to check, the rituals that gave shape to his days, that kept the ghosts at bay. He walked out, letting the screen door slam shut behind him, a sound of finality that felt like a lie. Out in the yard, the sun was higher, harsher. He picked up his tools, the familiar weight, a small comfort. He began walking the fence line, his eyes scanning for breaks, for weakness in the wire. It was a metaphor he did not care to examine too closely. His life was a fence, and he was its tireless warden. But as he worked, his gaze kept drifting back to the house, to the window where a pale face watched, a silent sentinel in his fortress of solitude. He found himself cataloging her, not as a person, but as a problem. She was thin, underfed, exhausted, frightened, but there was a core of stillness in her, a resilience that unnerved him. He stretched a new wire, the metal groaning as he tightened it. His hands, thick and scarred, worked with an economy of motion born of 1,000 repetitions. He remembered other hands, smaller, softer, trying to mimic his movements. A flash of memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass. A little girl with hair the color of corn silk, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to wrap a leather thong. "Like this, Papa?" He shook his head, the memory dissolving like smoke. He would not go there. He would not. He finished the section of fence and turned back. The day was wearing on. The girl, he did not even know her name, was still there. A fact. An immovable object in the landscape of his life. He walked back to the house, his steps heavy. He had to decide what to do with her. He could not keep her. He could not send her away. She was a storm cloud on the horizon of his clear, empty sky. She slept for a day and a night. A deep, feverish sleep that seemed to pull her down into the very grain of the wooden bed frame in the small spare room. A room that had not been used in a decade. Silas moved around the house with a quietness he hadn't known he possessed. He would stand in the doorway of the room and watch the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest under the coarse wool blanket. It was the only sign she was still among the living. He left food and water by the bedside. It remained untouched. He found himself listening for her, his ears tuned to the slightest creak of the floorboards, the softest sigh. The silence of the house had become a taut wire of anticipation. During the day, he worked. He rode out to the far pastures, the wind, a constant, scouring presence against his face. The land was vast, unforgiving, a sea of brown grass under a bleached blue sky. His cattle were scattered specks of black against the immensity. He felt at home here, in this emptiness. It matched the landscape of his own soul. But now, the image of the girl's pale face was superimposed over the familiar vistas. A ghost of a different sort. He found a hawk's feather near a watering hole, a perfect, intricate thing of gray and white. He picked it up, ran his thumb over its smooth vein. He remembered a small hand collecting such treasures, a voice full of wonder. "Look, Papa, a sky feather." He tucked it into his hatband, a gesture he did not understand. A small crack in the dam. That evening, as he cleaned a saddle in the barn, the smell of oil and leather a familiar comfort, he felt a change in the air. The wind shifted. It carried the scent of rain, a distant promise. He looked to the west. A line of bruised purple clouds was gathering on the horizon. A storm was coming. Not a gentle summer shower, but a plains storm, a thing of violence and power. He finished his work, his movements methodical, deliberate. He was building a wall against the feelings that threatened to surface. The girl in the house was an unknown variable. The storm was a known enemy. He understood storms. He knew how to brace for them, how to endure them. He went back inside. The house was darker, the coming storm stealing the light from the sky. He lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. He checked on her. She was stirring, moaning softly in her sleep. Her forehead was slick with sweat. He hesitated, then dipped a cloth in cool water and gently laid it on her brow. Her skin was hot to the touch. She flinched but didn't wake. The contact was brief, clinical, yet it sent a tremor through him, a forgotten tenderness. He sat at the kitchen table, the lantern hissing softly, and waited. For the storm. For her to wake. For something to break. The first word she spoke was not a word, but a name. A whisper in the fevered dark. Lily. It was a knife in his heart. He froze, the tin cup halfway to his lips. Lily. The name was a ghost on his tongue. A name he had not allowed himself to speak in 10 years. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He walked to the window and stared out into the gathering dark. The wind was picking up, rattling the glass in its frame. He did not know who this girl was, or why she had come to his door. But she had brought his ghosts with her, and now a storm was coming to give them voice. The storm broke just after midnight. It did not arrive with a gentle preamble of rain, but with a sudden, violent crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the small ranch house. Silas was awake, sitting in his chair, the cold embers of the fire his only company. He had been waiting for it. The sound was a physical blow, a war drum announcing the sky's assault. A flash of lightning bleached the world outside the window for a split second, etching the struggling shapes of the trees and the fence line against the churning blackness. Then came the roar of the wind, a living thing howling around the corners of the house, seeking entry. From the spare room, a sharp cry. Silas was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. He found her sitting bolt upright in the bed, her hands clutching the blanket to her chin, her eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. Another flash of lightning lit her face, and he saw it wasn't just fear of the storm. It was a deeper, more primal horror, a memory clawing its way to the surface. "It's just a storm," he said, his voice rough. The words were inadequate, pebbles against a tidal wave. She didn't seem to hear him. She was breathing in short, ragged gasps, her gaze fixed on the window as if she expected to see a monster looking in. The rain began, not as drops, but as a solid sheet of water thrown against the house. The wind drove it into every crack, a persistent, percussive drumming that filled the small space. "The fire," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound nearly lost in the gale. "The fire is coming." Silas felt a cold dread wash over him. Fire. The word connected the two of them in the storm-tossed dark. His fire. Her fire. He walked over and pulled the thin curtains across the window, shutting out the violent, strobing light. "There's no fire," he said, his voice firmer this time, trying to anchor her to the present. "Just rain." He lit the lantern on the bedside table, and the small, steady flame created a pocket of calm in the chaos. She flinched at the sight of the flame, then seemed to force herself to look at it, to study it. She was shaking, a tremor that ran through her entire body. He did not know what to do. Comfort was a language he had forgotten how to speak. He looked at his hands, calloused and clumsy, useless. He thought of Martha. She would have known what to do. She would have hummed a low tune, her presence a balm. He had no songs left in him, so he did the only thing he could think of. He sat, not on the bed, but in the straight-backed chair in the corner of the room, positioning himself between her and the window, a silent guard. He didn't speak. He just sat, a solid, unmoving presence in the room, his stillness a counterpoint to the storm's fury and her terror. For hours, they remained that way. The storm raged, a symphony of destruction. Thunder cracked overhead like the sky splitting open. The wind shrieked. And in the small, lamplit room, a man and a girl sat in silence, each trapped in their own storm, yet somehow weathering it together. He watched as her breathing slowly deepened, as the frantic terror in her eyes subsided into a watchful exhaustion. She never took her eyes off him. It wasn't a look of trust, not yet. It was a look of assessment, of desperate calculation. He was the only solid thing in a world that was coming apart. As the first hints of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, the storm began to recede. The thunder moved off into the distance, a grumbling, retreating army. The wind quieted its roar to a mournful sigh. The rain softened to a steady, cleansing patter. In the quiet aftermath, she finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "Thank you." He just nodded, the movement stiff. He had not protected her from the storm. He had stood with her in it. And in doing so, he felt a subtle shift within himself. A lock, rusted shut for a decade, had given way by a fraction of an inch. The storm had passed, but something had broken open inside the house. The world was washed clean. After the storm, a profound quiet settled over the ranch, broken only by the dripping of water from the eaves and the distant lowing of cattle. The air smelled of wet earth and sage, a scent of renewal. Silas moved through the morning chores with his usual economy, but his senses felt heightened, raw. The light seemed sharper, the colors of the wet land more vivid. The girl, Alara, he had finally asked her name in the gray light of dawn, and she had given it to him as if it were a fragile gift, moved about the kitchen with a quiet purpose. She washed the few dishes, swept the floor, her movements fluid and spare. An unspoken truce had been forged in the crucible of the storm. They did not speak of it. It hung in the air between them, a shared experience that had altered the landscape of their small, two-person world. That evening, he cooked. A simple stew of salted meat and potatoes. He usually ate standing by the counter, a functional refueling. But tonight, he set two places at the small wooden table. He placed a tin plate and a spoon in front of her. She looked at it, then at him, a question in her dark eyes. He just grunted and sat down, a clear, if gruff, invitation. They ate in a silence that was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with the companionable sounds of spoons against tin and the soft hiss of the lantern. It was in the low, flickering light that he saw it. A faint scar on the inside of her wrist, pale against her skin. It was small, jagged, shaped like a spark or a tiny forked branch of lightning. He looked away quickly, his own skin prickling. He knew that shape. He had seen it burned into the floorboards of a ruined cabin. He had seen it in his nightmares. He said nothing. The stew was tasteless in his mouth. After the meal, he found himself restless, the confines of the house suddenly too small. He went to the barn, the lantern swinging in his hand, casting dancing shadows. He picked up a length of supple leather, a knife. He began to braid. His fingers, usually so sure, felt clumsy. He was making a simple cord, a thing of no real purpose, but the repetitive motion was soothing. He felt a presence behind him and turned. Ilara stood in the wide doorway of the barn, a silhouette against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. She watched him, her expression unreadable. He gestured with his head toward a nearby crate. She came and sat, tucking her feet beneath her. She did not speak, just watched his hands as he worked the leather, the 3 strands weaving into a single strong cord. The memory rose unbidden, gentle this time. Lily, her small hands fumbling with the leather. "Show me again, Papa. I want to make one for Mama." His fingers stilled. He looked down at the half-finished braid in his hands. He took a breath, the air thick with the smell of hay and rain-damp wood. He held out the leather to Ilara. "You try," he said, his voice quiet. She hesitated, then took it from him. He showed her the motion, his rough, scarred thumb guiding her slender fingers. Over, under, pull tight. A simple pattern, a way of making something whole out of separate strands. Her touch was light, tentative. For a moment, their hands worked together, his large and weathered, hers small and scarred. It was a connection far deeper than words, a shared lesson, a shared scar. They did not need to speak of the fire. In the quiet of the barn, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, they were already beginning to braid their stories together. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm established itself. Silas would work the ranch, and Ilara would tend to the house, but the lines blurred. She started following him, at a distance at first, watching as he mended a gate or calmed a nervous horse. He never told her to stay or to go. He simply allowed her presence. It was a silent apprenticeship. He showed her how to read the clouds, how to find water, how to listen to the language of the land. She was a quick study, her senses sharp, her connection to the natural world intuitive, as if she were remembering a long-forgotten skill. She began to wander the property on her own, her solitary figure a small, dark shape against the vastness of the plains. She never went too far, always keeping the ranch house in sight. Silas would watch her from a distance, a strange mix of protectiveness and apprehension churning within him. The land held memories, and he didn't know which ones she might uncover. He worried she might find the graves, the two simple wooden crosses on the low hill overlooking the creek. He wasn't ready for those questions. One afternoon, he saw her walking toward the west pasture, toward the grove of scorched cottonwoods that stood like skeletal fingers against the sky, toward the ruins. He felt a lurch in his gut, a primal urge to call her back, but he remained silent, frozen in place, as he watched her disappear into the trees. That was where it had happened. The place he had not visited in 10 years. The foundation of the old cabin was still there, a stone footprint filled with weeds and ghosts. The air there was different, heavy with a silence that was not peaceful but dead. He saddled his horse, his movements jerky, and rode out, but not toward her. He rode in the opposite direction, pushing the horse hard, as if he could outrun the memory, but the land held it fast. He could see the column of smoke in his mind's eye, smell the acrid stench of pine and ruin. He could hear the terrible silence that came after. When he returned hours later, as the sun was setting, casting long, mournful shadows, she was sitting on the porch steps. She was holding something in her hand. She watched him dismount and walk toward her, her expression solemn, her eyes ancient. She didn't say a word. She just opened her palm. Lying there, stark against her skin, was a single bead. It was made of blue glass, but its surface was blackened and cracked on one side, its perfect roundness marred by intense heat. A fire-scorched bead. Silas stopped dead. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at the bead, and the carefully constructed walls of a decade came crashing down. The air left his lungs in a ragged rush. He could not breathe. He could not think. There was only the bead, a tiny, accusing eye staring up at him from her open palm. It was a key to a door he had locked and sealed and sworn never to open again. He knew that bead. He had held its identical twin in his own hand for 10 years. He had bought a whole string of them for Lily at the summer fair, their color matching her eyes. She had loved them. He turned, stumbling away from her, away from the bead and the truth it represented. He went into the house, into the suffocating quiet, and walked to the old sea chest that sat at the foot of his bed, the one he never opened. His hand shook as he fumbled with the rusted latch. The latch gave way with a groan of protest, like a joint stiff from disuse. The lid of the chest swung open, releasing a faint, trapped scent of dried lavender and old sorrow. Inside, nestled in faded linen, lay the relics of a life he had tried to bury. A child's dress, the color of a summer sky, neatly folded. A man's worn wedding band, and a small leather pouch. Silas's hands, usually so steady, trembled as he reached into the chest and lifted the pouch. The leather was soft, worn thin with handling. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his calloused palm. A handful of blue glass beads, identical to the one Alara held, save for one crucial difference. These were perfect. Smooth, cool, untouched by flame. And among them, one that was not blue, but a deep, vibrant red. Lily's favorite. The heart of the necklace, she had called it. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the beads digging into his palm, the dress a soft weight on his lap. The dam of his grief, so carefully maintained for a decade, finally broke. It was not a storm of violent sobs, but a quiet, steady rain of tears that traced paths through the dust on his cheeks. He did not weep for what he had lost. He wept for what he had remembered. Alara appeared in the doorway, a silent shadow. She still held the scorched bead in her hand. She looked from the contents of the chest to the tears on his face, and a look of profound understanding dawned in her eyes. She walked slowly into the room and knelt on the floor beside him. She did not touch him. She just waited. The story came out of him in broken pieces, fragments of a narrative polished, smooth by a decade of silent, obsessive retelling. "The storm," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Lightning hit the big cottonwood, the roof. It was so fast." He looked at his hands, seeing not the weathered skin of the present, but the helpless, useless hands of the past. "I was in the barn. I tried. The smoke. I couldn't get to them." He choked on the words. "Martha, Lily." He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with a pain that was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. "I found the cabin. After. Just ash. I found nothing. Nothing left. So I built the crosses. I told myself they were gone." He wasn't telling her a story. He was making a confession. He had not just lost them. He had failed them. This was the truth he had lived with. The poison that had hollowed him out from the inside. He had built this ranch, this life of solitude, as a penance. A monument to his failure. He was a man who couldn't protect his own family. Alara listened, her gaze unwavering. She held up the scorched bead. "I found this," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through his haze of grief. "By the creek, far from the cabin." He stared at it, a flicker of confusion piercing his sorrow. The creek was a quarter-mile from the ruins. There was no reason for a bead to be there, unless it hadn't been lost in the fire. Unless it had been dropped. Dropped by someone fleeing. A new, terrifying thought began to form in his mind, a thought so full of impossible hope it felt like a betrayal of his grief. He looked from the scorched bead in her hand to the perfect ones in his own. A story with a missing piece. A history written in ash with one page torn out. Alara's gaze did not waver. She held the scorched bead out to him, placing it gently in his open palm next to the others. The fire-kissed bead and the perfect ones. The past and the story he thought he knew. "After the fire," she began, her voice low and steady, a strange counterpoint to the turmoil in his chest. "I ran." Her story, like his, came in fragments, sharp-edged memories pulled from a deep well. "There was smoke, shouting. Not just the storm. Men. On horseback." Silas's head snapped up. Men? He had seen no tracks but his own. The storm had washed everything away. He had only assumed. A woman, Alara continued, her eyes distant, seeing a scene he could only imagine. She found me, hiding in the reeds by the creek. She grabbed my hand. There were other children. She pushed us, told us to run, to follow the water and not stop. She paused, taking a breath. She had a voice like a low hum. It made you feel safe even when you were running. She smelled of lavender. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. Lavender. Martha always had sachets of dried lavender tucked in her pockets, in the linen closets. It was her scent. She gave me this, Alara said, touching a place on her own neck. A pouch. It had beads in it, she said. If you get separated, if you get lost, hold these. Remember that someone is looking for you. Remember the color of the sky. Alara looked at the blue beads in Silas's hand. They looked like these. The room was silent. The only sound was the frantic pounding of Silas's own heart. His narrative, the one he had clung to for a decade, was unraveling. Martha. Alive? Fleeing? She ran back. Alara whispered, a child's awe still in her voice. Toward the fire, to find more. She told us to go. Just go! Her story tumbled out, a child's memory of terror and grace, of being led through the dark by a woman of impossible courage. They had traveled for days. The woman, Martha, had protected them, fed them, kept them quiet. But she had been hurt. A burn on her arm from a falling ember. She grew weaker. A few days later, in a shallow cave miles from here, she had died. Her last act to push the children deeper into the shadows as riders passed nearby. Alara was the only one who had stayed with her to the end. The others had scattered. Alara had eventually been found by a traveling family who took her in, but she never forgot. She never forgot the woman with the lavender scent and the sky-blue beads. The name Martha was never spoken. The name Lily was never spoken. But they hung in the air, solid and real. Silas stared at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as an intruder or a ghost, but as a messenger, a living testament. His wife had not died cowering in a fire. She had died a hero, saving children. The story he had told himself of his own failure, his weakness, was a lie. A ghost story he had invented to punish himself. The truth was a story of her strength, her courage. The weight of 10 years of self-recrimination began to lift from his shoulders, not gently, but with a sudden, gut-wrenching violence, leaving him lightheaded and gasping for air. He was not the widower of a victim. He was the widower of a warrior. The ranch was not his prison. It was her legacy. He looked at Alara, at the faint scar on her wrist, at her dark, solemn eyes. She was the last person to see his wife alive. She was the child Martha had saved, a living piece of his wife's soul, delivered to his doorstep by a fate he couldn't begin to comprehend. The grief was still there, a vast, hollow space inside him, but its shape had changed. It was no longer a monument to failure, but a testament to love and sacrifice. The guilt, the toxic shame that had been his constant companion for a decade, was gone, burned away by the clean fire of the truth. He looked at Alara, this girl who carried his wife's last moments, and he felt not sorrow, but a profound, aching gratitude. She had brought him the one gift he thought he would never receive: absolution. He stood up, the bead still clutched in his hand. He walked to the window and looked out at the land. It looked different now. Not empty, but waiting. The weight of his penance had been so heavy it had flattened the whole world. Now, the colors seemed to be returning. The sky was bluer. The grass held hints of green. The horizon was not an ending, but a beginning. He turned back to her. Come, he said, his voice quiet but steady. He led her out of the house, past the barn, and up the low, grassy hill that overlooked the winding creek. The air was cool, the sun warm on their backs. At the crest of the hill stood two simple wooden crosses, weathered gray by sun and storm. He had carved them himself, his hands raw, his heart a block of ice. Martha, Lily. He had come here every day for a year, then every week, then only when the grief was too much to bear. He had spoken to them of his sorrow, his regret, his unending failure. He stopped before the crosses. Ilara stood beside him, a quiet, respectful presence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the beads, the perfect ones, and the single scorched survivor. He knelt in the soft earth, the same way she had knelt at his fence line. An echo, a completion. He dug a small hole with his fingers at the base of the two crosses, right in the center. He placed the beads inside, a final offering. The red one for Lily, the blue ones for Martha, the scorched one for the journey that had brought the story home. He covered them with dirt, his hands gentle. Then he looked at the names carved into the wood. And for the first time in 10 years, he spoke to them not of what he had lost, but of what he had found. "Martha," he said, his voice breaking, but with pride, not pain. "She told me. A girl named Ilara. She told me what you did. You saved them." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I was wrong. All this time. I thought I had failed you. But you never failed anyone. You were so strong. I'm so proud." He touched the wood of Lily's cross. "Your mother was a hero, little bird. The bravest person I ever knew." The words were a release, a river breaking through a dam. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the dirt, the sun on his back. Ilara did not move. She simply stood vigil, a guardian of his reckoning. When he finally rose, he felt lighter than he had in years. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer howling. They were quiet. They were at peace. He looked at Ilara, and his eyes were clear. "Thank you," he said. And this time, the words meant everything. He had been a man living in the past tense, a keeper of ashes. Now, the future felt like a possibility again. He turned and looked back at his ranch, the small house nestled in the vast landscape. It was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was a home. And it was waiting for them. A new dawn. But this one felt different. It wasn't the start of another identical day in a long line of them. It was the start of something else entirely. The light that spilled over the horizon seemed to carry a promise. Silas rose early, as always, but his movements were different. The rigid, methodical economy was replaced by a sense of purpose that felt less like defense and more like creation. He lit the fire in the kitchen hearth, and when Ilara emerged from her room, a cup of hot coffee was waiting for her on the table. She gave him a small, hesitant smile, and he nodded in return. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a comfortable, shared space. It was a language they had built together, out of storms and scars and scorched beads. After breakfast, he didn't just walk out to his chores. He paused at the door. "Coming?" he asked. Her face lit up. From that day on, the ranch had 2 keepers. He taught her everything, how to mend the fences not as a way of keeping the world out, but of keeping their world safe. He taught her the names of the grasses, the habits of the hawks, the way the creek swelled after a rain. He showed her how to gentle a horse, not with force, but with patience and a low, calm voice, a voice he was rediscovering in himself. She, in turn, brought a different kind of life to the ranch. She had a touch for growing things. One afternoon, Silas found her near the ruins of the old cabin, clearing away the weeds and turning over the soil, the place of his greatest trauma. He started to protest, the old instinct to protect the wound rising in him. But then he saw what she was doing. She wasn't erasing the past. She was planting a garden. She had found a packet of wildflower seeds in an old tin in the barn. She worked the soil, her hands gentle in the dark, rich earth. He watched her for a long time, then went to the barn, returning with a shovel and a hoe. He didn't say a word. He just started digging alongside her. They worked together, turning the ash-fertilized ground into a place of future beauty. They were planting over the ghosts, giving them a bed of flowers to rest in. Their days found a new rhythm, a harmony of two notes instead of one. They rode the fence lines together, their horses side by side. They shared meals at the table, the conversation sparse but meaningful. She would tell him about the small things she'd noticed, a new foal in the north pasture, a family of quail near the creek. He would tell her stories of the land, of his father who had built the ranch, stories he hadn't told in decades. He was rebuilding his own history, word by word. He was no longer just the man the fire left behind. He was a rancher, a teacher, a guardian. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. A hawk circled high above them, a familiar, solitary shape. But then another joined it, and the two birds soared together on the evening thermals. Silas watched them, a slow smile touching his lips. He looked at Alara, who was watching them too, her face calm and peaceful in the fading light. She was no longer the haunted girl who had knelt at his gate. She was home. The land was no longer a prison of his grief. It was a legacy of his wife's courage, and a future for the girl she had saved. The silence was finally, truly, his again. But it was no longer empty. It was full. There are wounds that time cannot heal, but which truth can. For 10 years, Silas had lived in the shadow of a story he had told himself, a narrative of failure carved from the ashes of a tragedy. He was a man defined by an ending. His life was a long, quiet epilogue. But the arrival of a stranger, a girl kneeling in the dust, was not a disruption to his story. It was its most crucial, missing chapter. She brought with her a different truth, not one that erased the pain, but one that redeemed it. She showed him that the story was not about a fire that took everything, but about a woman who saved what mattered most. It wasn't about his failure to protect, but about his wife's ultimate act of love. The ranch, once a monument to what was lost, became a testament to what had endured. The fences that once held him in became the borders of a sanctuary. The silence that once amplified his loneliness became a space for peace to grow. The land, which had been a witness to his sorrow, became a partner in his healing. He learned that a home is not just a structure of wood and stone, but a place where stories are shared and woven together, where the past is honored, not buried. He found that family is not always the one you are born into, but sometimes the one you build, piece by broken piece, in the aftermath of a storm. And so, the solitary rancher was no longer alone. He had found a daughter in the echo of his wife's courage, and in teaching her how to care for the land, he had finally learned how to care for himself. Sometimes, the most profound journeys do not cross vast distances, but merely travel from a locked chest to an open palm. We build fences around our hearts to protect ourselves from pain, but those same fences can keep out the very truth that will set us free. Perhaps healing does not come from forgetting the ghosts of our past, but from learning their true names, and in doing so, finally allowing them and ourselves to be at peace.